All right, so we're looking at the law, and again, we're looking at the law through the lens of how does this tutor us. This next section, this is verses, chapter 21, verses 2 through 11, and I just have verses 2 through 6 on the screen, is about slaves and servants. And Pastor Adrian, you asked me to preach on this passage, and I'm like, man, slaves and servants, would I have chosen this passage? No. There is part of me that looked at that, and I'm like, I don't want to touch that. Because it is a loaded phrase in America today. But what we're going to see as we read this passage is this word slave, just like the word tutor, really wasn't a perfect translation. This word slave is not a perfect translation because in modern America, we don't have slaves or servants. We don't have slaves, and the most recent slaves we had in America, boy, that was an ugly thing. This is not what the Bible is talking about at all. It's the same word, but it's not what the Bible's talking about at all. Similarly, the word servant, you're like, maybe the word servant would be a better word. Well, it might be in England where they had servants. In America, servant has been a bad word since the country was founded. They're like, we're not servants. We don't do that. Maybe that's an attitude problem with us as Americans, but as a result, that word servant isn't a word that we understand. And hopefully you're going to understand it a little bit better by the time we get through this. So I'm going to go ahead and read verses 2 through 6. If you buy a Hebrew servant, again, this is God speaking to Moses. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years. But in the 7th year, he shall go free, without paying anything. If he comes alone, he is to go free alone, but if he has a wife when he comes, she is to go with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to her master, and only the man shall go free. But if the servant declares, I love my master, and my wife and children, and do not want to go free, then his master shall take him before the judges. He shall take him to the door or the doorpost, and pierce his ear with an awl. Then he will be his servant for life. So, you will hear detractors of Christianity, skeptics of Christianity, critics of Christianity, and they will tell you the Bible condones slavery, and that's why I can't believe the Bible. I can't believe a good God would condone slavery. Is this slavery in the way we know slavery? How long does it last? 6 years. That's not slavery, that's a contract that says I will work for you for 6 years, and then I will stop working for you. We can renew that contract in 6 years if you like, or not. It's a mutual consented thing. And so why would you do this? Well, to pay off a debt would be a big reason to do that. You're like, man, I'm in debt up to my eyeballs. I'm going to go work for this person for 6 years. They'll pay off my debt. And then at the end of 6 years, I will go free. I will be debt-free. They will have paid off my debt. Everything's fine. Or maybe it's the person you're in debt to. Well, then they won't pay off your debt. They will forgive your debt. But regardless, it's just a contract, and it's a pretty civil thing to do. Maybe you're not used to a 6-year contract, but I taught part-time for many years, and I would sign 6-month contracts every semester, sign a new contract. Yes, I want to still work here. Please give me classes to teach. And that was it. I couldn't quit in the middle of the semester. If I had quit in the middle of the semester, I don't know what they would have done, but it would have not been a good thing to do. So, yeah, you got 6 years, seems like a long time. Well, if you're young, it seems like a long time. Many of you are looking at me like 6 years? No, that's not a long time. When you were 6 years old, it seemed like forever. It was a lifetime. All right, so that's the first thing here. The second thing about this slavery that is different, again, from how we understand slavery in modern America is you'll notice the slave might choose to remain with his master. I can't picture that. I mean, our picture of American slavery, man, people being beaten, people that were kidnapped and stolen from their homes and now they're being beaten, or people whose parents were stolen from their homes and they were therefore enslaved just because they were born to the wrong parents, or people whose parents were free but they were enslaved because they happened to be traveling south of the Mason-Dixon line and somebody said, oh, that's your skin color? Cool, you're enslaved. Wow. That's not what this is talking about at all. This is saying, gee, you signed a contract to be a slave, and if you liked the experience, if you said, man, that was a great 6 years and I want to do this for the rest of my life, you can. It's really a cool thing. And that's why actually if you see pictures of servants from Middle Eastern cultures, you'll often see a servant with a single earring. What is that? That's what this is talking about. You go to the door or the doorpost, the door of the home that you're going to be serving, because the family and the home are kind of tied together, and they would pierce your ear, like basically into the doorpost. I guess that's how you do an ear piercing. You don't just you can't do it in midair. So boom, pierce your ear, and you're get an earring to show that you are a servant that chooses to serve. You are a bond servant for life by choice to this family, to this home that you've chosen to serve. So, okay, hopefully we've addressed the whole there's slavery in the Bible thing. Now, there are other passages in the Bible about slavery, and they're worth looking at and talking about. We're not going to go there this morning in terms of those things, because we're just here in Exodus. But hopefully it's been addressed, and we can get past the very loaded language, which, again, in today's society in modern America, just hearing that word, again, I don't think it's a good word. I mean, this is more like some sort of employee than it is like a slave, in the sense that we understand slavery. But it is a slave in the sense that during that 6 years, this person does what the master says. And again, you can't leave, and there's big penalties for that beyond bankruptcy court. So, all right. Also, by the way, verse 16, which I did not read, condemns kidnapping, period. Abducting people, period, is condemned. And so that means, again, this is not like the slavery we knew in America, where people were kidnapped and forced into slavery. The final point I want to make about that before we look at what we can learn from this slavery in the Bible is if you want to know for sure that what the Bible condones is not the slavery we knew in colonial America and colonial Britain, ask the slave masters from colonial Britain. Because, you see, they wanted to appear to be Christian. Back then, if you were British, then you claimed to be Christian. Whether you followed the Bible or not, you followed God or not, because if you said, "Hi, I'm an atheist," people said, "What is wrong with you, you degenerate? Don't you understand even basic Christian charity?" I mean, if you were kind, people say, "Well, that's a Christian person." If you had a first name, they're like, "That's your Christian name." I mean, it was just everywhere in society. So if you wanted to be accepted, you had to claim to be a Christian. And so if you enslaved these poor people and beat them and did horrible, unbiblical things to them, and people are like, "That doesn't seem very Christian," well, you say, "Well, I gave them a copy of the Bible." And so if you go to Washington, D.C. today, there's a place called the Museum of the Bible. I've never been there, but I found it online, and I hear it's kind of cool. And one of the things they have in there is the so-called Slave Bible. The full title of this is Parts of the Holy Bible Selected for the Use of the Negro Slaves. You know what they did? They chopped up 2/3 of the Bible, took it away, and said, "This is all the stuff that might convince slaves that what we're doing to them is wrong and might make them want freedom, and we're just going to cut that out and only keep the parts that either have nothing to do with slavery or freedom or liberty, or keep the parts that have to do with that and make it sound like it's a good thing." So they took out, from what I understand, the story of Joseph. It's gone. Don't want to see somebody that was kidnapped and abused and stuck into slavery and God used them and raised them up into the second highest position in Egypt. Don't want that. Stuff in the New Testament, I don't know, verses like, "It is for freedom that he set us free." Yeah, don't want slaves reading that. That would be a problem. They chopped it up. The slave owners recognized that the Bible did not condone what they were doing. The slave traders recognized that the Bible did not condone what they were doing. They knew it full well, and they chopped up the Bible as a result to say, "Here's what we'll let the slaves read." The parts that say, "Servants, obey your masters." The parts that say, "Be kind." Oh, that's good. We want our slaves to be kind. The parts that say, "Worship." That's fine. Parts that say, "Sing a hymn." They can do that. The plagues of Egypt. That's fine. But they cut out the parts that they thought were going to inspire people to something else. So again, if the slave masters themselves didn't think the Bible condoned what they were doing, it didn't. Nobody ever thought it did that gave it serious thought. Now, many people didn't give it serious thought and just assumed everything was okay. All right, so now that we've got that out of the way, what can we learn from this passage on this type of slavery? And again, this is talking about a contract, a working relationship, and I'm not advocating that that's how we should sign contracts. Pastor Adrian, we're not going to put you on a 6-year contract, and if you decide to stay, nail your ear to... No, we're not doing that. Anyhow, so what can we learn if we're not to learn that? Well, the first thing, the biggest thing that I can learn is slavery is a fact of life. You are a slave. You were born a slave to sin. Hopefully, you have a new master, and you are serving God voluntarily, willingly, because we just learned that slavery can be willingly done. In fact, Jesus spoke of this in John chapter 8, To the Jews who had believed him, Jesus said, "If you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." They answered him, "We are Abraham's descendants and have never been slaves of anyone. How can you say that we will be set free?" Jesus replied, "Very truly I tell you, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. Now a slave has no permanent place in the family, but a son belongs to it forever. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed." Everyone who sins is a slave to sin. You ever felt like a slave to sin? Me too. Now maybe sometimes you're sinning and you don't feel like a slave to sin. Sometimes you're sinning and you're like, I am freedom. I have freedom to do what I want to do. Maybe you've said that. Maybe before you were a Christian, you said it a lot. You're like, I don't want to be a Christian because I'll lose my freedom. Maybe before you were married, you said, I don't want to get married because I'll lose my freedom. That's a phrase. People have like bachelor parties to I don't know, I'm losing my freedom. What are you losing your freedom? No, you are gaining a spouse. What are you losing? Your freedom. You're gaining salvation. You're gaining a relationship with the living God. That's not a loss of freedom, but we tell ourselves that it is. And so it's easy to see that. And so we see here, yeah, you're a slave to sin. If you think you're free to sin, if you think you're free to do what you were not designed to do, God has a purpose and a plan for you. And you're like, yeah, I'm free to not follow the plan for my life. It would be like me having, I don't know, not me. I don't play with toys. Yes, I do. But they're my son's toys. It would be like my son having a toy that I'm playing with, and this toy is supposed to, I don't know, drive across the room, and if I push the button, turn right and turn left. And instead, the toy has the freedom to not do that. It has the freedom to stand still when I'm supposed to push the button, or to drive backward when I want it to drive forward. Then it would be a really lousy toy. That's not freedom. Yay, my toy has the freedom to not follow my directions. Then it's not a good toy. It's not succeeding in what it was designed to do, which is to be played with, to bring enjoyment to someone. It's like it's only bringing frustration instead of enjoyment. So yeah, freedom, Jesus says, is for freedom. In Galatians, Paul writes, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery." Paul's writing, you know what? You came out of slavery to sin. You've been set free by Christ. Don't be burdened by a new slavery. What is Paul writing about here? Well, you might think, well, return to that same life of sin you came from. And I guess that's true. Don't return to that same life of sin. If you've been set free from whatever it is that was plaguing you, don't go back to it. But Paul was primarily writing here about the law. There were a group of folks in the early church called Judaizers, and they came through with the law, like the book of the covenant, and they said, great, you Gentiles, you people that just became Christians, now that you believe Jesus, follow these rules from the Old Testament. We're all going to live like the Old Testament. And Paul's saying, don't get under the yoke of the law. We don't need to go under that yoke. So again, don't get back under that. Now, again, that doesn't mean, some of those things you learned last week, like, oh, I don't know, do not commit murder. Yes, don't do that. You're still under that law. Don't murder people. But you know what? Even if you do commit murder, you can be forgiven. In fact, not only that, Jesus expanded on what that law really means. He said, what does that mean? It means if you even hate your brother, you have murdered him in your heart. Wow. That means most of you have committed murder. I'm an only child, so I'm good. That's a joke, because brother doesn't just mean biological brother. It means your brother, your sister. Here are my brothers and sisters. If I hate one of you, I've murdered you in my heart. So, I'm so glad we're forgiven and we're not under the law, and we don't have to live up to that, because I can't. Matthew 11:28-30. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Again, Jesus is talking here, a yoke? That's a beast of burden. That's a creature that serves its master. And Jesus says, come to me. The yoke is lighter. The burden is lighter than what you're carrying on your own. So yes, we voluntarily choose to serve him. And how long did this bondservant that chose to serve him serve? For his whole life. When you choose to follow Jesus, it isn't for 6 years. It isn't joining the military and saying, yeah, I'll do a 4 years here, maybe re-up afterwards. It's saying, you know what? I'm going to give my whole life to you. Wow. So this thing It's this obscure contract from the Old Testament that's kind of confusing language to modern Americans is really what our relationship with God is to be like. We're to voluntarily come to him saying, I'm not serving you by force. I'm not serving you because of the debt I have. I'm serving you because I want to serve you forever. All right. So the next passage here deals with justice. And there's actually a couple types of justice mentioned here. The first one is justice as it relates to personal injuries. And I'm not going to read the passage, but essentially it comes down to if you cause an injury to someone else or death, which is an injury, pretty serious, then there's consequences for those injuries you might cause. And it talks about intent. Was it intentional? Then it's murder. If it wasn't intentional, then here's how you can be saved from the penalty of that. And if you break something, again, if it's intentional or not intentional, it matters. And how do you make restitution? And that's what this passage is about. And in this passage, we actually see the phrase, if you break somebody's tooth, then you should lose a tooth. And no, they didn't do that. Basically, the person whose tooth was broken would be like, yeah, here's how much my tooth is worth. Pay me. Which is similar to how we do things today. But let's see what Jesus has to say about this. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 through 42, Jesus is speaking. He says, you have heard that it was said, eye for an eye and tooth for tooth. And again, that's in this passage. It's in this book of the covenant. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. And so Jesus is saying, you know what? You've got the right to demand this, but don't. If you want to treat somebody in love, if you want to treat somebody as God is treating you, we can see the law instructs us we have rights. The law instructs us we have personal property, and if somebody infringes those rights, then we've got the right to some sort of recompense, to some sort of retribution, to some sort of compensation. But you can turn away that right. Somebody slaps you, you don't have to hit them back. Somebody breaks your tooth, you don't have to turn around and sue them in court. Jesus is saying, somebody slaps you, let them slap the other cheek as well. Now, somebody's trying to slap my child, he doesn't say, let them beat up my kid. But he says, you know what? Slaps you, it's not going to kill you. Turn to them the other cheek and say, you know what? I see you got an issue. You got something to work out. I don't. You're going to show them love, and they're not going to understand it. But maybe they will later. Maybe you'll be planting a seed and showing them God's love and showing them what Jesus did, because Jesus did the ultimate, turning the other cheek. Jesus did the ultimate. God of the universe, creator of the heavens and earth, came to earth in human form and was more than slapped. He was mocked. He was spit upon. He was beaten. He was executed. And he did not seek revenge. All right. I have notes. I should probably read them. Was there anything else I was supposed to say? Acts chapter 5, verses 3 through 4. Ananias and Sapphira. This is the early church. And again, this is one of those passages that non-believers, people that are critical of Christianity, I don't know if you want to call them non-Christians, unbelievers, non-believers, people that aren't on the same page as I think most of us are. They look at this passage and they go, what kind of God do you serve? So it's the early church, and we read about how some people were like, man, I love God's people and God's church, and I've got an extra piece of land over here, so I'm going to sell it and give away the money and give it all to the church. And the church can use it to help the poor. The church can use it for whatever they need to use it for. I'm just giving it to God. Great thing to do. If you'd like to, there's an offering box in the back. We'll take deeds to houses. No, don't do that. That's a joke. I've heard of people giving sermons like that. No, don't, no. Unless God is leading you to, in which case, I'm not stopping you. But I'm not asking, I'm not encouraging you to do that. All right, but Ananias comes, and he sells a piece of property. And he tells everybody, I sold some property like they did. And I'm giving all the money to the church like they did. But he lied. He sold the property for a certain amount, and he told everybody he sold it for less and that he was giving it all to the church. And here's what Peter says to him. Peter says to him, Ananias, how is it that Satan has so filled your heart that you have lied to the Holy Spirit and have kept for yourself some of the money you received for the land? Didn't it belong to you before it was sold? Again, same thing I just said. It does not belong to the church. God has given it to you. You have property rights. It says so in the Old Testament. And after it was sold, wasn't the money at your disposal? It was his. It was his land, and he sold it, and then it was his money. And he could have kept all that money for himself. There's no sin in that. He could have done it. It was his. He could have said, you know what, I sold some land, and here's 10% of the sale, like to give to the church, or 30, or 40, or whatever he wants to give. Here's what Peter says. What made you think of doing such a thing? You have not lied just to human beings, but to God. Now, if you were to lie to God, you probably won't die like Ananias did. I mean, you're going to die, but you're probably not going to die in that manner. Like, hey, I just lied to God and the church, and I'm dead. And I'm thankful for that, because it would make my job a lot harder as I speak to you this morning. And you're like, hey, no, I don't need people dropping dead in the back of the sanctuary today. That would not be fun in any way. Please don't die this morning. But why did this happen? Because it was the early church, and God needed to set an example of the church is Jesus' representation on earth. If you're lying to the church, you're lying to Jesus. And he needed to make that clear. That was tutoring us. Not to say, you know what, you're going to drop dead, but tutoring us to say, don't lie to the church, because lying to the church is lying to God. Don't lie to the church in order to puff yourself up to serve your idol of money, which is really what Ananias did. All right, the next set of verses here talk also about justice and compensation, but this time not about personal injury, but instead, not about, that was personal property. They continue to talk about personal property. And again, looking at this more in the New Testament, 2 Corinthians 9:7, each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. So again, in the Old Testament, there are laws about having to give. Why? Because it's your stuff. If it's your stuff, then you can give it as a tax, or give it voluntarily, or give it as a requirement, and there's laws about all those things. And God here says, hey, what was that tutoring us? It was so that you know, hey, you're going to have stuff. You're going to have the opportunity to give. You get to give stuff cheerfully. So that's what we can learn from this law here in the Old Testament. Now, again, you're taking my word for it for now, because we didn't read it. I'm sorry. It hurts me not to read the entire, 3 chapters. You guys want to stick around till 3 o'clock and we can read 3 chapters? And that laughter says no. All right. The next set of verses here talk about the Sabbath. What can we learn from the Sabbath? So first of all, the Sabbath is not Sunday. If you thought today was the Sabbath, you have been misinformed. Today is not the Sabbath. Yesterday is the Sabbath. If you speak Spanish, you know that, because sábado. That's their word for Saturday. If you speak English, you don't know that, because Saturday is no. And Sunday doesn't tie to that either. But anyhow, the Sabbath is not Sunday. So the odds are pretty good that you aren't keeping the Sabbath the way that it says to do here in the law. So what can we learn from this if it isn't about keeping the Sabbath? Well, the first thing we learn is we're to take the Bible at face value. When God says he created the world in 6 days, and on the 7th day he rested, and he created the Sabbath as a result to commemorate that, it's saying, you know what? God created the world in 6 days and wants us to commemorate that. That's important. What else is it saying? It's saying that God has created us with a need for rest. If you think you can work 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and you're like, I can do this, I don't know how long you'll pull it off, but your body is not designed for that. And your spirit is not designed for that. Your spirit will be crushed through that kind of work. That's one of the reasons that I'm preaching this morning. Pastor Adrian has been studying other things this week, has had other things that he needs to do. And if we said, you know what, cool, do your other things and preach on Sunday morning, he would start feeling crushed by the workload. And so we did not want to do that to him, so here I am. And I'll be here next week as well. We need rest. But also, what do we read about the Sabbath? In Matthew chapter 12, verses 1 through 14. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. I don't know if you've ever done that. I love hiking. I've never picked grain while I'm hiking, but I've picked blackberries while I'm hiking. Oh, I love hiking. You find a blackberry bush, or bike riding, and you hit a bump in the road, and you fly over your handlebars, and you land in the middle of a blackberry bush. And then you realize, man, they're not even ripe. This is very disappointing. But if they were ripe, it would have been worth it flying into the bush. You know, that's how good they are. So the disciples are hungry, and they see this grain, and they pick some, and they eat it. When the Pharisees saw this, and they were all about keeping the law. In fact, they kept laws that weren't even in the book. They're like, yep, there's more laws. They were like, keep the law, keep the law. They said to him, look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath. They're doing work because they picked grain and stuck it in their mouth while they were walking by. Now, most reasonable human beings wouldn't consider that work, but the Pharisees did. They were a little bit unreasonable about things like this. And Jesus answered, haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. But God didn't condemn him for it. God said, that's okay. You're the anointed king of Israel. It was okay for that. Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on the Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? We like to joke that our pastor is the easiest job in the world. You only work one day a week, and then it's just in the morning. Sometimes into the afternoon if you're, a Baptist and can't stop at noon, but once a week. And so the priests did the same thing. They had Sabbath services. Somebody had to lead the people on the Sabbath. Somebody had to light the lights and all of this stuff. And Jesus is here pointing out, did you never notice this, that there are people actually commanded to do work on the Sabbath? Now, those people had a different day of rest, I'm sure. If I tell you that something greater than the temple is here, and if you'd known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. One of the things we're to learn about the Sabbath, one of the things the law tutors us in, is that Jesus is Lord even over the Sabbath. Going on from that place, he went into their synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus, they asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Pretty sure that's work. That's why the hospital is open today. They've got work to do. He said to them, if any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. What he's saying is, why do you say that this is a law? Because you can't heal people. If you can't heal people, it's easy to condemn people for doing healing on the Sabbath. That's work. I can't play football at a professional level, and so it's easy to condemn a professional football player and say, what are you doing? You're working on the Sabbath. You just picked a career where you're pretty much going to work on Sunday every week. I know it's not the Sabbath. I just said that, but you get the idea. Okay, I know some days it's Monday, and then there's that whole Thanksgiving game thing, whatever. But you're working on Sundays by choice. What are you doing? Is that lawful to do? Well, yeah, if you want to be a professional football player, if that's the talent God has given you and the way that he's leading your life, then yes, you're going to be working on Sundays. If you signed a contract as a professional football player and you show up and you're like, Sunday morning I got to go to church, and you know what? It's my day of rest, but I'll show up on Monday. I'll be there for practice all week long. Don't worry about it. I'm just going to miss, all of the games except for a Monday night game and Thanksgiving. You're fired. You're not doing your job that God has given you to do. Now, you better still find a place to be fed spiritually. You better find a church that will feed you on a Saturday or a Monday or a Wednesday. That's why we have a Wednesday night Bible study. So any professional football players listening to this, you're invited to our Wednesday night Bible study. And Sunday morning during the off season. So then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. So he stretched it out and was completely restored, just as sound as the other. But the Pharisees, so what's that about? Well, first of all, Jesus has compassion. That's good. Jesus has the ability to heal. That's good. But this is even more powerful because Jesus could do miracles. But he just made this statement it's lawful to heal on the Sabbath. How do you back that up? You use the power of God to heal on the Sabbath. That way it's no longer just an intellectual argument. It's saying, you know what? See, I just pointed out how you really think it's okay to do good on the Sabbath when it's, your sheep. And he pointed out that David did something on the Sabbath, and that was okay. But then he says, you know what? Look at this. God's power healing on the Sabbath. God's power to heal would not happen if this was a bad thing to do. But the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. He healed somebody on the Sabbath, and they said, we should probably kill him for that. All right, the last part of this is about festivals. There were 3 annual festivals. I'm not going to get into those this morning because time. But one of them is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And I want to talk just briefly about that because leaven. Oh, what does unleavened mean? Like, we don't talk like that. I'm sorry. That's bread made without yeast. Leavening, yeast. Puffed up bread. So unleavened bread, crackers and tortillas. If you're Jewish, that's matzah bread. If you're familiar with matzah bread. If you're not, we're talking unleavened bread, flat breads. It's the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and during this feast, they would not have any bread with yeast in it. And this feast is actually, we looked at it a few weeks ago, a couple months ago in Exodus, as we were looking at the Passover, and this is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It's part of the Passover celebration. Well, there's a couple other feasts here, and they all have symbolism. So what is the symbolism? Well, yeast symbolizes sin. Why? That's weird. Why would yeast symbolize sin? Well, Jesus points out in the New Testament, a little leaven leaveneth the whole lump. Is that like King James? I said leaveneth? Well, that's how I memorized it. A little leaven leaveneth the whole lump. A little yeast works its way through the entire batch of dough. That's how sin is in your life. If you've got a little sin in your life, you're like, you know what? I'm done with this, and I'm done with this, and I'm done with that, but this sin I'd like to hang on to. Boy, it works its way through your whole life. Because that little sin, you're like, hey, I'm going to hang on to this. You know what? If you're hanging on to that one sin intentionally, then you're also hanging on to pride. Because it's your pride that says, you know what? I'm going to continue to sin even though I know God said not to. You're also hanging on to gluttony? Is that what you call it? Like self-pleasure? You're like the sin of I just want to live for my own pleasure? Because obviously this sin is something you think gives you pleasure more than the joy that God has in store for you, more than what he has said is right. And so, yeah, yeast is a symbol of sin. Also, what does yeast do? It puffs things up. Sin does that a lot. I've been puffed up by sin quite a few times in my life. What else does yeast do? It ferments things. It makes them go bad. You leave yeast in there too long, and what you've got is no longer usable. You've got alcohol, and it's not the good kind. You wouldn't like it. And you're like, that's crazy. No, it's true. Actually, during the Revolutionary War, General Washington, being a reasonably intelligent man, said, yeah, troops, you're not drinking on duty. And he got guys coming in like drunk. Turned out they were eating the bread dough to get drunk. Some of them intentionally, some of them accidentally, but they're like, yep, I can't have my booze, I'm going to go have my bread dough with the yeast in it. And that's when they switched to dry yeast. So if you use wet yeast, it will create alcohol. It's a thing. In fact, I actually heard of a fellow that got arrested for drunk driving. It was in the Midwest somewhere, and it turned out he had a yeast culture in his stomach, and it was living in there, and every time he ate anything that could be fermented, it fermented in his stomach. And he's like walking around literally getting drunk from food. I mean, I guess not drunk, but intoxicated from food. Yeah, and they give him a breathalyzer test, and there's no alcohol in his mouth, so he's like passing that, but he's, clearly inebriated, and then they do a blood alcohol test, and he's clearly, intoxicated. So it was a weird medical condition, and one of those things you hear about. Okay, yeast symbolizes sin. What does this have to do with these festivals, these annual festivals the Israelites were to celebrate? Well, one of the things this talks about is Jesus. Because Jesus was actually crucified during the Passover. That's not an accident. It's not a coincidence. God has a plan. God has always had a plan. Nothing happens by accident. God is not surprised. It wasn't like, hey, Jesus happened to be crucified during the Passover. Jesus chose to be crucified during the Passover. God planned on the crucifixion taking place during the Passover. Because Jesus said, as he ate that meal with his disciples, this is my body, this bread. What does he mean? Well, part of what he means is it's without sin. My body without sin. Not mine. Jesus. Yours has sin. He's like, this bread that symbolizes sinlessness, that symbolizes me. And the wine that they drank as part of that meal, the Last Supper, that was also part of that Feast of Unleavened Bread. And so this foreshadowed Jesus, and there's all kinds of symbolism. We talk about Pentecost. That's another one of the feasts the Israelites celebrated. They didn't call it Pentecost. That's a Greek word meaning, 50 days. But because it was 50 days after the Feast of Unleavened Bread. But we now know that feast symbolized the coming of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit came at Pentecost, and if you study what that feast is about in the Old Testament, you can see how it points to the Holy Spirit. And so I would encourage you to study these things. I've got takeaways for you this morning. Here are the takeaways. Takeaway number 1, study. Acts 17:11. Now these people were more noble and open-minded than those in Thessalonica, so they received the message of salvation through faith in Christ with great eagerness, examining the Scriptures daily to see if these things were so. I have not read to you most of the passage in Exodus. I have summarized things. I've told you what things are. Your job is to read the passage in Exodus and see if what I told you is correct. If it's not, then your job is to come tell me. Say, hey, Glenn, you screwed up. And if it is, then your job is to learn from it, to believe. Takeaway number 2, be holy. Be set apart. All right, now you're not going to be perfectly holy, but recognize that God has set you apart and live like that. And if you have been convicted this morning, if when I've talked about sin, something has come to mind, maybe you're like, man, I am playing fast and loose with the truth. I just do that, and I've excused it as my personality. It's okay. That's just who I am. I say things like that. Maybe you're rude, and you've excused it as your personality. You know what? I treat people rudely, but they all don't. They know it's just me. It's just Glenn being Glenn. Maybe it's lust. You're like, man, yeah, I know. I look at people that way. And it's okay, because it's just who I am. If you've realized that it's not okay, it's not just who you are, it is sin that's in your life. Be holy. Try to get rid of that. Now, you may need to enlist the help of someone else. Maybe you need an accountability partner. Maybe you don't. I don't know what your sin is. Some of you sure know. I don't know what your sin is. I don't know what your struggle is. I don't know what you need to overcome that, whether you can just do it in your own will. You're like, you know what? I'm done with it. Maybe you need to pray about it and say, God, I need your help to be done with this. Or maybe you need an accountability partner and say, hey, you know what? I'm struggling with this. Can I just talk to you about this and be accountable to you about this thing? I don't know what it is. Maybe you've been convicted. Maybe there's nothing big like that that's got a hold of you, but you realize, you know what? I'm still tempted. We all are. I'm still sinning pretty much every day. Thank you very much for reminding me about that, Bible tutor. But as you sin, just go, you know what? God, this isn't what I want to do. I want to be holy. So that's takeaway number 2.